Okay, well, it's
We
6
saved it.
o'clock, so let's get started. We're so glad to have you all here for our Mormon Scholars in the Humanities, What is Mormon Literature panel. And we have a very distinguished panel today, and the leadership of the Association for Mormon Letters are here to answer all questions related to Mormon literature. And just a little bit about Mormon Scholars in the Humanities. We're an interdisciplinary within the Humanities Association dedicated to promoting collegial exchange among LDS scholars and mentoring superior scholarship in all the humanistic disciplines. And this is part of an initiative leading up to next year's conference. We'll be having a monthly panel for a few months going forward, one about Mormonism and the arts, Mormonism and law, and we've had one on Mormonism and intellectual history, what is Mormon thought, and we'll be posting this video for anyone who wasn't able to tune in. And we're so grateful to Andrew Hall for moderating and introducing the panelists. And I'm going to turn it over to him, and feel free to pop any questions you have in the chat. We'll be monitoring those and have those have a roundup around 7 o'clock of those questions. So feel free to take it away, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And we would like to thank the Mormon Scholars in the Humanities for inviting us to participate today. We see this as a kickoff for the virtual Association for Mormon Letters Conference, which will be held from May 30th through June 5th. The AML was founded in 1976 by a group of people, including Leilani Fielding Anderson, Eugene England, and Maureen Ursenbach Beecher, for fostering scholarly and creative work in Mormon letters and to promote fellowship among scholars and writers of Mormon literature, they said. Leonard Arrington, who was then the church historian, invited the group to hold their first meeting in the conference room of the church office building. And this led to an investigation by the First Presidency about what Arrington was doing. Who were these people in the conference room? And after questioning Arrington about it, President Kimball gave the organization his blessing. The organization hosts an annual conference where awards are presented to works of fiction, poetry, drama, and a variety of genres. It publishes the literary journal Iriantum, which is now published online, and runs a literary blog, Dawning of a Brighter Day. If you search for AML online, you will immediately find the program for this year's conference, which will begin in the evening of May 30th with James Goldberg's presidential address. This year, the association is working on creating a canon of 100 significant works of Mormon literature. So from June 1st to June 4th, there will be evening panels of experts on different eras of Mormon lit. Each evening will end with readings by this year's award finalists in 10 different genres, so you'll get a chance to sample the best work being produced by contemporary authors. The conference then culminates on Saturday, June 5th, where there'll be sessions honoring exceptional authors and educators, John Benyon, who will be presented with the AML Lifetime Achievement Award, and Stephen L. Peck, who will be presented with the Smith Pettit Foundation Award for outstanding contribution to Mormon letters, our own tiny MacArthur grant for authors with great pasts and bright futures. And the AML awards will then be presented in a ceremony that evening. So today I'm joined by 4 all-star authors and critics to talk about what is Mormon literature and why and how is Mormon literature. Let me introduce them. Melissa Leilani Larson is a playwright, unquestionably Mormonism's greatest living playwright. Her newest play, Mestiza, or Mixed, was commissioned by Plan B Theater, where it will premiere in June 2022. Pride and Prejudice will open at Creekside Theater Fest in June, Little Happy Secrets at the Great Salt Lake Fringe in August, Persuasion at UVU in February 2022. So she's got a lot of great works coming out. Film works include Jane and Emma and Freetown and an upcoming short, Patience. Her honors are many, including the 2018 AML Smith Pettit Foundation Award for Outstanding Contribution to Mormon Letters. And Mel will begin serving as the president of the AML later this year. Is that right? I can't remember the dates of the turnover, but something like that. Nicole Wilkes Goldberg earned her MA in American Literature from Brigham Young University in 2009 and divides her time between teaching persuasive writing and raising 4 children. Nicole married into Mormon literature, which has given her opportunities to co-create and perform a piece at the Center for Latter-day Saints Art, which received an AML award last year, co-edit the annual Mormon Lit Blitz contest, and was published in the collection Moth and Rust, Mormon Encounters with Death. James Goldberg is Nicole's husband and is a poet, playwright, essayist, novelist, documentary filmmaker, scholar, and literary translator who specializes in Mormon literature. He is currently serving as the president of the Association for Mormon Letters, chair of the Mormon Lit Lab, and on the advisory board of the Center for Latter-day Saints Arts. His 8th book, The Bollywood Lovers Club, is coming out in July. It's a novel co-written with Jancy Patterson about a sick girl and a Mormon guy who fall in love. Eric W. Jepson, also known as Eric Jepson, is a writer of fictions, including the novel Byuk. Byuk, is that how you pronounce it? Byuk?
How I pronounce it.
And several published short stories and poems. He is also a publisher and editor of such works as The Fob Bible, Monsters and Mormons, and a scholarly edition of Nephi Anderson's Dorian. He guest edited a special issue of Sunstone on Mormon comics. He's the co-host of the Dialogue Network podcast Face and Hat, and the editor of the literary journal Iriantum, and a former president of the AML. He lives in El Cerrito, California with his wife and children. Okay, welcome to the four of you. Now, before we talk about what is Mormon literature, let's maybe start with why Mormon literature. Maybe specifically, why is Mormon literature important to the Restoration Project? Or is it? Who'd like to take a stab at that? Eric, I'm just going to call you out. Eric.
All right, sounds good. There's a lot of ways to answer this question, but I'm going to share an anecdote. And the first time I really realized how important Mormon literature would be to me was shortly after I graduated with my bachelor's degree. And I read My Name is Asher Lev, which is not about Mormons, but the way that that book explores how the arts can interact with a religious culture, in this case, he's Jewish, Asher Lev is. And it made me realize that our arts and our literature are an essential part of who we are. And when we dismiss Mormon culture as being something like suburbans or, you know, whatever it is that we don't like about Mormon culture, we're missing the great goal of our faith. Like Joseph Smith wasn't just about revealing facts about God. He was definitely a culture builder. He was a nation builder, and I feel that we have that obligation. And so anything we can do to build ourselves up as a people is, I think, a necessary part of the whole experiment of being a Latter-day Saint. And so the last part of your question was, is it part of the ongoing restoration? And I would argue yes, for a lot of reasons, which will probably come up again more. But I don't think the restoration is complete unless there is a people to live it. And you can't really be a people unless you have a culture.
Yeah, I like that. One theorist who was helpful to me in thinking about this kind of stuff is named R. Radhakrishnan, and his field is diaspora studies. So what does it mean when you have a culture that's no longer associated with national borders, the way that a lot of people in the early 20th century thought about how cultures work? And a thing that Radhakrishnan talks about is what it means to have a shared imagination scape, that you may not occupy the same land anymore, but the imagery and the memories and the stories bind you together. And so I think like Mormonism as this transnational culture, it's acts of imagination, right? And it's imagery and memory that keep us together. And literature is one tool where we can be really proactive about tending that. So in that sense, I think it's part of it. In terms of restoration projects specifically, two approaches come immediately to mind for how literature can contribute to that. And one is to like investigate it and meditate on what we mean by restoration. I think of like Brandon Sanderson's probably our most commercially successful writer right now, and his giant Cosmere crossbook project is based on a mythos of a shattered God, right? That there was this one God who got broken into pieces, and shorn of their context, these pieces don't work the same way they used to. It's a meditation on some of our ideas about what restoration means. Another way I think literature can do the work of restoration is by helping us re-enchant time. So like one of the features of Joseph Smith's restoration relative to the religious landscape he was coming from is he could say again, like we're in sacred time. This is what's happening now is equivalent to what's happening in scripture. We're another dispensation. And I think of like Gene England's Blessing the Chevrolet, or actually Mel's Little Happy Secrets. Both for me are ways of telling stories in ways that make the experience in their generation sacred. So Jean takes like a pioneer image of blessing cattle across the trail and talks about blessing his car. And Mel takes some of the like struggle and heartbreak over identity that a lot of people experience now and sacralizes it, right? Like gives sacred meaning to that. So I think those are two ways for me that art can do the work of restoration.
Mel, what do you think about that?
Thank you, James. That was very kind. I just think storytelling is important to us on a human level, and therefore important to us as a culture, as a group of people. Storytelling is just part of the human experience. It's something that we're always drawn to. I think that it's significant. I've always found it personally significant that Jesus himself used story to teach. And I think the best stories teach even without, they teach without teaching, if that makes sense. And Eric Samuelson once told me that all roads lead to restoration. And I feel that that's something that shows up in our work even when we don't intend it to. So.
Nicole, is that anything?
So as I was thinking about this, one of the things that I thought of, and kind of riffing off what Mel was saying, that I feel a little bit that Mormon literature is always working with the tension of faith and hope with kind of the inevitability of an apocalypse, right? There's like this, and maybe if you'll forgive me to just call like Latter-day Saints apocalyptic thinking, and just kind of open your minds to that, this being a way to think about it. But I feel like a lot of what we do as members of the church is work within this space of tension. Do we have faith and hope? And we have hymns that are saying this, you know, like, hey, if we die, it's all right. Yes, rejoice if you die. And like somehow one way or another, we're going to meet Jesus and it will be good. And if it's that we meet Jesus because we went through a lot of garbage to get there and our lives end early, then that's great. And if we meet Jesus because the world went through a lot of garbage and he came to intervene, that's great. But there is a fear in that tension as well. The fear of, am I good enough to meet Jesus? Am I good enough to stand before God? And I think that is a big tension in Mormon Letters as a restoration project, because we're trying to find that space in a pretty apocalyptic and hopefully apocalyptic, like it's this hopeful apocalypse space, and so that's kind of where I'm coming from with that.
Okay, and let's stick with you, Nicole. So I think we got a pretty good idea of why, but we've been asked to define a what, and I don't think there has to be one single definition. We'll probably have, I'm sure we're going to have a few different ones, but so what is Mormon literature to you? How do you define it?
Actually, James and I talked about this, so I'm going to turn it to James because he's going to give the definition, and then we can riff off it, because that's how we roll. So
the Association for Mormon Letters defines Mormon literature as anything by, for, or about Mormons or Mormonism, right? To this follow-up question about can there be multiple definitions? Absolutely, right? And it kind of depends on what's useful for you at the time. So Susan Howe, when she's writing poetry, says she sticks with the by definition and says, I have a Mormon mind. Anything that's the product of my Mormon mind is Mormon literature in some sense, right? And that's useful for her in the composition stage. when Nicole and I are editing the Mormon Liblets contest, we're focused on the 4. How would this work resonate with an audience?
And an audience becomes really key in that, because we're encouraging Mormon writers by giving them Mormon readers, which is a tricky thing. And I think anybody who's ever written anything and called it Mormon literature, you're like, I'm putting it out there, will there be a reader? So
Yep. And then the last being the about. I think it's useful sometimes to talk about, okay, there may be lots of things that are by Mormons or maybe Mormon market, but let's look at the subset of things that are having a conversation about Mormonism. One way I think of it sometimes is which things are written in Mormon. If Mormon is the language that we're using, not everything by a Mormon is also in Mormonese, right? But I'm interested sometimes in that subset of ideas and imagery. And so you can define it multiple ways productively, and it just depends on the context.
Mel, when you're writing, and sometimes your plays have Mormon characters and sometimes they don't, do you think of yourself as writing Mormon literature? I mean, how do you think about yourself in that way?
Oh goodness. When you phrase it like that, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know that I think about it until it's interesting that Nicole mentions the audience, because I don't know that I think about it until I think about the audience, and then I worry about whether or not they're going to show up. Which is just, is actually not terribly Mormon. It's just like the life of a playwright anyway. It's like, is there going to be an audience? Is the audience going to outnumber the people in the cast, which is typically when it's okay for a show to go on. And if the audience does not, if the cast outnumbers the audience, then you cancel the show. It's interesting because I think about, this is something I go back and forth a lot, and James and I have actually, I think, in a way, argued about this multiple times too. I am a strong believer in the by and the for, and I'm less sure about the about. And I don't necessarily, when I'm writing a play, set out to write Mormon literature. I don't aim for it to be Mormon necessarily. Sometimes Mormon characters show up and I say, oh, hey, this spot is for you. Sometimes they show up and I say, this is not your play. Hold on. I like where you're going and I'm going to save you for later. It's hard because I think when I have set out to say, I'm going to write a Mormon play, it almost slows me down before I get started. It feels like it's a destination rather than I just going to mix up my metaphors, but it doesn't sound like a place to start for me personally.
Okay. Eric, how would you define Mormon literature?
I like all the definitions we've heard, and I don't really take issue with them. I'm in the process right now putting together a collection, and I'm trying to decide how much of my criticism to include. And I realize as I read my criticism that I think I'm pretty good at dealing with individual works of art and even placing them in their sphere, but I'm not a great theorist. And I imagine there's a lot of theorists here today. But I think what I've learned as I've been looking through my old stuff is that I really am interested in this conversation. And Nicole was talking about audience, and I think that's a huge part of it. And Mel was too. And the great thing about a play is you can't pretend that an audience will show up someday. Like, they have to actually be there or nothing happens, which it's easier to pretend audiences don't matter, I think, when you do what I do. But I think the audience, the great thing about literature is the audience is not constrained, fourth dimensionally speaking. Like, you can read Piney Ridge Cottage by Nephi Anderson today and love it. Like, it is a great book and you will find value in it. But he definitely wasn't writing for us. And one of the great powers of literature is this ability that we have to have a conversation across time. And so I think part of being Mormon literate, if you will, is engaging with the with the reading. And that's true even of us writers. Something I like to tell my students is that Hamlet is not the greatest thing ever written because it's the greatest thing ever written, but Hamlet is the greatest thing ever written because we've done more talking about it and writing about it and arguing over it and putting it on stage and reimagining it. And our literature can't grow and become excellent until we really give it enough attention. So I think maybe, to go back to the audience question, maybe Mormon literature is what we pay attention to. And we can decide what it is by just where we direct our gaze.
Well, that brings us to, I mean, you are all authors, but you're also all critics and looking at, these past works. And this year, the association is working on creating this canon of great Mormon literature. So the current generation is aware of the key works that came before. But do why, I guess we're doing this, so I think you think it's important. Why do you think this is important? I mean, does this kind of awareness of the canon enrich the culture? Does it help contemporary authors in their writing? I see Mike Austin's here too. I know he's very interested in canon as well. But why are we doing this? What's the point of it? Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think it's important because we don't know what to pay attention to. We just don't, right? Because as a culture, we are not great at remembering our books. Like speaking of Nephi Anderson, like Added Upon was the only one of his books that stayed in print beyond a single printing that lasted for decades. The rest of his books, which are less ambitious, arguably, but certainly better, have largely been forgotten. And if we don't, here's something that happened to me in my 20s, and I see it happening to people in their 20s now. The archive is having a thing immediately after what we're doing. When you're in your 20s and you recognize that there's value in your own people having art, and you look around and you can't find it, you feel like you have to start from scratch. And so what we have is this generational theme in the Mormon arts where we're always starting from scratch because we don't know that there's something out there. And this, a great works list, for all its failings, and it will certainly have failings and be disagreed with, which is valuable also, but it gives people a place to look and to recognize, like, people do write poetry, right? There is a place for me. And so while I think it's most valuable to readers, I really like collapsing readers and writers into a single entity. I also think it's really valuable for writers to see that I am working in a tradition and I don't have to make everything up from scratch and I can be part of something. And I think that's really valuable.
James, what do you think?
Yeah. No, I definitely had that same amnesia thing too, right? I remember at 23 getting started with Mormon literature and just having no idea of what had come before. And honestly, it didn't even really occur to me that there was stuff. I guess there's this bias where you assume that you would have heard of something. And so if you haven't, you think it's not there. I would say beyond that, that to the extent that we preserve stuff by folk memory, it may kind of get filtered. So like Orson F. Whitney's talk Home Literature, where he said someday we'll have Miltons and Shakespeare's of our own, is partly remembered not because Orson F. Whitney was the most important or interesting writer of his generation, but because he later became an apostle. Nephi Anderson was involved with church hierarchy, right? And so without some proactive work to try and say where could we put our attention, we're going to end up filtering down an anemic de facto canon that has even more bias than canons have often been accused of creating. So I think if we do some conscious work on canon, and I know this is something Nicole and I have talked about a lot and she has strong feelings on, but doing conscious work to say, here's an entry point would be useful.
I guess you just turned it over to me. I actually, I'm really resistant to the idea of the canon. I have, and you might even be able to see them, a lot of Norton anthologies, right? Like anybody who went through an English program at the college level, you have a lot of anthologies. And interesting, yep, Eric's got his display. Interestingly, there, you know, there's like the general anthology. Oh, here's American literature. Oh, here's American literature from this era. Here's African American literature. Here's postmodern American literature. Here's Jewish American literature. And the anthology project, this canon project, they're trying to say, oh, we'll do all of these things. And then like you get the revised Norton Anthology of American Literature, and suddenly there are poems by, you know, Native American writers from like, and poets from the time that early European settlers were coming, and they're beautiful and interesting, and nobody studies them because we have to read the dead white guys. And I worry about that. Oh, and Emily Dickinson. Mm-hmm. I worry about that because of the church hierarchy that we have, and the records that we have are mostly like older white men in the in North America, and particularly now in the Wasatch Front. And we lose a lot of records of really interesting, great work that we can't even access anymore. You know, there are historians who are going through the Women's Exponent to try to find these, and looking in the home literature and digging through stuff. But James was talking earlier about, when we were talking, he said the Armenian Exodus, they had an essay contest, and all of those essays are lost. Every essay, we don't have those. And what if the greatest Mormon essay ever written was by one of those Armenian Mormons? And so the canon is useful in a lot of ways. The 100 works list, I can see why this would be useful. But what I want to see is an open canon. I want to see a canon where we're more inclusive. We're getting more voices from around the world, where we are getting more minority, more women's voices. With the Mormon Lit Blitz, one thing that we have been so happily surprised about is 2 years ago, we had an international contest. And the past 2 Lit Blitzes, we've gotten submissions in Spanish, Portuguese, Estonian, Japanese, like, because we said, hey, we will look at your work. Mm-hmm. And we need to let people know this is still open. And I think that's part of the problem with the canon, is it feels closed. And so we want to do the work of opening that up.
Is there any works that we're going to be talking about that this week, but that just you're excited to get people aware of from the past that
well, if I embarrass people who are here, there are like 3 of my favorite writers in this panel right now. I love to bring people to Mel's plays, for sure. Sometimes I bring like my whole family, and we get that. I love sharing Mary Jane Rice's poetry with people. I currently have one of her poems on my fridge, and kind of make people read it, like, read this poem, it's so good, and they love it. And I also love Darlene Young's work. And I think, I know we talk about like the Shakespeare's and Milton's, but I was like, no, we've got Christina Rossetti and Emily Dickinson. We even have like our playwright of Austin here. Like the women writers who are writing these days are phenomenal. We have amazing poets.
And I do think playwrights, if we can sort through, and BCC Press has done some really valuable work on building up the canon, but I'd mentioned before Orson F. Whitney and Nephi Anderson, who are great writers, but helping people understand there was just so much female energy going into writing in the early 20th century. I'd love people to have a few go-to works there. And if the list can highlight those, that'd be good. Another one I'm hoping will make the list, I don't know, we're still working on process for how do you do cross-language comparison. But probably the first work of Mormon literature that I remember having a big impact on me is a book called Confession Mormona by Gerd Skibbe. That's in German. He was born in the 1930s, so was a young man during World War II, and then was in the East Side, and so experienced the communist years. And it's just a very honest memoir, as well as having some really interesting literary structure. And yeah, I mean, it just totally opened things up for me. And I don't think, I mean, it's like very hard to find now. And Eric and I had a discussion about, if you highlight a work and say it's significant, hopefully that motivates people to go and improve access, right? So that there start to be ways not only to be aware that things exist, but to go look for them and ease that access. So I'm excited about having a few works that are kind of hard to find, difficult, and hopefully the act of recognition and saying they're part of a conversation will help them from becoming help prevent them from becoming the next lost work, right? We'll be able to preserve these texts because we took the time to care.
Mel, what do you think about canon?
I think Nicole just blew my mind a little with that. The greatest essay ever written could just be lost. I'm just thinking about that essay now, and I am intrigued by this idea of talking about what's in the canon, so to speak, loosening the possibility of words. Where are all the words? Loosening the what people think about what should go in the canon, and opening up this idea, again, going back to what Nicole was saying about, like, potentially pointing at things that aren't necessarily on the list that we are not aware of. Like, if we put out a list and say, hey, these are some great works that you should be aware of, and that brings up a lot of things that we are less aware of, I think that would be great. Because I think the thing that's tricky about Mormon literature is it feels at times to be really niche, and isolated in a way, and very insular. And when I was studying English and I was planning to be a novelist before I accidentally became a playwright, there was this, I made a decision. I was not going to write Mormon fiction. I felt like it was so specific, and so I just felt really, really, the word in my 20-year-old brain was narrow. It felt narrow. It felt myopic. And I had to go away from Utah and from where I grew up to realize that those stories were important and they were in me and that I needed to tell them, and that they are not narrow, that their specificity makes them universal. That was a huge lesson for me personally. But it's been being said in the chat that, and James was talking about this a little bit too, that access is so important. And I think that this is just going to be hopefully the beginning of a conversation that we need to keep going. I think Mormon literature has suffered from a lot of stops and starts, and we just need to get things greased and rolling and keep it rolling. There's a lot of ideas. That was some words.
May I jump in, Andrew?
You can. Let me just say too, everybody, we're going to have questions at the end. So go ahead, and as we go along, if you think of any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll give that to the panel at the end. Eric, please.
So James earlier said that Mel's plays can sacralize like the modern Mormon experience, and I really like that description. I think it's a really good description of what Mel does, and it ties back to your first question about how is literature part of the restoration. And when you look at the Bible, like a huge percentage of it is poetry, right? There's the wisdom scripture. There's some crazy stories in there, and of course the Bible is a story of chaos and a history of chaos. So like we don't need to get into where the Bible came from, but I think there's a really important comparison here in that there should be, I think, in a culture, a distinction between the poets and the prophets. And we have a very clear hierarchy of like prophecy and where the prophetic stuff comes from. but that doesn't negate the need for the poets. And I think we've had a really, really clear example of this over the last 10 years with the publication of Dove Song and the publication of Rachel Hunt Steenblick's poetry. And what we've seen of Dove Song, and of course it came from, it started with the research that, oh, I just forgot his name. He just passed away.
Martin Polito.
Yeah, Martin Polito, but who is the lead? The other guy.
David Paulson.
Yes, David Paulson. Thank you. Like that was his project, and Martin and Rachel helped him on that. And so it starts with the research, but then the poets explore this way, and they push the conversation forward in a way that the prophets are a little more constrained. We don't have like out of the wilderness prophets. We have business suit prophets, and so poets fill that need. And all the conversation that we've been having about the divine feminine in over the last 10 years. Yes, like the research was important, but it's the poets who push it forward. And we see that in the history. Like Eliza R. Snow wasn't even the first one to write a poem about Heavenly Mother. And so this is a role we have. And it gets to what Nicole and James were talking about all the female energy. And there's so much in the literature. And if we can capture that, all the value, not just like the artistic value and the personal value, but the cultural value and this quasi-prophetic poetic value will also be able to be preserved and become part of us and move us forward in ways that there's no other way forward except for we need to use our poets. That's what they're for.
That's great, thanks. Mel, let me give it back to you. Who would you like to see remembered more in the canon? Who are you excited for this canon project as a chance to maybe make people aware of their work?
Oh, well, I've recently become a big fan of Virginia Sorensen. I think that I really enjoy her work, and I don't think we talk about her nearly enough. I think there are some folks that are very well known that I think future generations we need to be sure that they're aware of. Eric Samuelson is one of those as far as drama goes. Thomas Rogers. I feel like someone asked the question once on social media, is like, I think it was William Morris who asked, what was your first encounter with Mormon literature that you remember as a child? And I think my dad had books of Carolyn Pearson's poetry, and I didn't think about them at the time as being anything but poetry. I didn't think about them as being Mormon. I just thought about them as being poems. And I remember getting those books and just feeling that they're beautiful, that those words were, I didn't understand all of them, but I felt like they were calling to me in a way. So I think Carolyn Pearson is someone that we need to remember. And I feel like there are probably quite a few people that I need to familiarize myself with. I feel like this is, I don't feel as well read as I need to be. I'm focused on the theater. I want to make things. I'm making things all of the time, and I need to stop and take a look at what's being created and read and be more aware of things outside of what I'm personally doing.
The fact that there's no Eric Samuelson collection that's published yet is one of the great lacks that we have. That's something that really needs to be fixed. I mean, there's
Michael Perry at Zion Theatricals, I believe, is working on publishing Eric's works he has the rights to publish them and license them singly, and he's working on collections. So
good. Okay, well, so that was the what is it, and on the canon. Let's see, how do you think okay, what do you think Mormon literary artists, so Mel's talking about, focusing on her own work, but so how is this whole project and learning about Mormon literature and just, I guess, in general, how can we encourage artists to raise the level of their craft, raise their profile in literary circles? I mean, do we have a role in doing that, in helping people? Do you have any advice for what they should be doing? James?
Yes, I have feelings. I think one of the first steps is not to just blame everything on writers, because we've had a history of that a little bit, and that goes multiple ways, right? You'll have people who kind of dump on writers if they think they're not representing the community in a positive light, or if they're not orthodox enough, right? That's one side. You also, from maybe more like this crowd, right? People who are interested in literature and sophisticated, there's a sort of, we're embarrassed. Let me back up. I remember doing a paper about a Pakistani poet I love, and reading one of the early literary critics in Pakistan, post-independence, 1960s, talking about his country's poetic tradition. And it started with like this long apology. And there's this line that said, like, you know, in the hierarchy of poetic forms in the world, the ghazal ranks very low. And so, you know, he's saying, here's our art form that I love. Before I talk about the poets who worked in it, I'm going to tell you I know it's terrible. And I think sometimes we have the tendency to do those same disclaimers for our own community and just say Mormon writers are bad, and to hope that someday writers will get good enough that we will be respected and we won't be like a colonized people anymore, right? Like that somehow magically that's going to work. And I think that's absolutely the wrong approach. I think instead we've got to accept the work that exists on its own terms and say, look, like people are doing interesting things within the constraints of the resources available. And then, I don't know, like offering that time, the talents, and the resources, you know, if you want better Mormon writing, like Eric was saying, like if we invest attention in the stuff that we already find interesting, that's going to help. That's going to make other people want to rise to conversations. I mean, a lot of people who are here have talents and abilities in cultural and literary criticism. Like, if you guys don't write about what we're doing, how is it going to be respected? There's no point where you're just magically good enough as a writer that creates conversation. Like, somebody has to make the conversation happen. So that's an important part. I do think that there's like a whole economic infrastructure question. I don't think we need a ton of everything, but for complicated reasons having to do with the 1990s, Brigham Young University's English department has kind of actively discouraged Mormon lit. Like, they haven't been the champions they arguably should have been. And that's neither here nor there, but that's a reality. We need alternate structures to give somebody something. Nicole and I did just launch a project with the Mormon Lit Lab, where we asked people who have been past contest finalists to pitch us a book that they would like to write. And we said, we'll work to do fundraising to get you a budget of $1,000 if we can, right? It was amazing to me, the outpouring of proposals that we got for people to write a book. This is tons of work.
We thought we would get like 5. We're like, let's just accept everybody. And we're suddenly like, oh my gosh, we have to make choices.
Yep.
So people want to do this.
Yes. But knowing that they were going to have some mentoring help and a small budget made a huge difference and enabled stuff. So I do think we need to get infrastructure in terms of budget and supportive talent and the hope of conversation and audience afterwards.
And it's really on the critics, and it's hard. It's hard to, as a critic, especially if you're at a university, to get credit for, you know, doing work on Mormon lit. It's hard, and there's no question about that. But that is where the conversation will be elevated, is, well, you know, like the stuff is out there. We just need to get the critical conversation going.
What do you guys think about criticism? Is this important? Does it raise the level of the culture? Eric or Mel, either one?
Well, yes. I mean, it sounds a little snobby to say raise the culture. Maybe expand. How do you feel about that? Because something I've noticed is, and this is something we've already said a million times, but stuff just gets forgotten. And without the critics are such an important part. The critics get a lot of crap, but the critics deserve credit for like figuring out how things connect and pushing things forward into the future and continuing the conversation. And it's hard to do that without the academy. It's true. Like we in the AML are very envious of you, because a lot of the other parts of the humanities are having much more success at getting more scholarly attention to their fields, and literature, I think, is languishing in this respect.
Like, what do you mean by that? How are the other fields? What's working?
Oh, well, what I mean is, like, there are journals for like Mormon history, as an example, right? And there's a lot of work being done in terms of like sociology, and we're starting to see the beginning of what looks like a real flowering of Mormon theology. And there just aren't as many people working in literature. And man, would we love to recruit some people, because without the conversation, it's the old, if nobody's in the forest, tree problem, right? There are trees falling all the time in our forest, but it's not clear that anybody's hearing the noise.
Right. So the BYU English department was a pretty strong supporter, at least, not a detractor of these kind of studies for a while. And most of the AML presidents in the 70s and 80s were coming out of BYU English department, at least a majority of them, I think. And then, in the 90s, that kind of got pulled out, at least by the end of the 90s. So there's a lot of just kind of independent, it's moved into this kind of independent world now, of the people that are involved in AML.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, I don't know. We don't have prophets in the wilderness. We got poets in the wilderness now, right? And it's not a bad place to make art. But some of that question, at least in the written form that I'd seen before, but I think in the way you phrased it, had to do with how do you get currency in academic circles? Well, you get currency in academic circles by people doing academic work. I think there's important things that can happen artistically without any criticism, but I think the way for Mormon literature to make roads within academic discourse is no longer like, there are the objects to work with, right? It's not that there is nothing you could write criticism about or try to use as an example in joining another larger conversation. The missing piece to have currency within that particular field is critical work.
Well, now, so critical work is extremely important. Then there's just the business aspect of getting the works out to the public, finding a way to get the works in people's hands. And Liz Busby in the comments was asking about the role of Mormon bookstores, Mormon literature. If we can't get books into Desert Book, is the reach of the book is limited? What can we do about it? Now we have here on the panel, we have Eric has his own, he's a publisher of his own independent publishing house. James and Nicole have this Mormon Lit Lab, which they're getting things out to people, and Mormon Lit Blitz, in which they're getting literature to people through the internet. Mel is a entrepreneurial, getting her plays produced all over the place. But okay, so what does this say? What is the future? Do bookstores, even online bookstores, still have a future? What do you see in coming up in getting literature into the hands of people, helping people become more aware of these things, kind of in a business point of view? Eric, so you've been selling books, you've been writing some books.
Yeah, and we have put out some very nice books, if I may say so. You should own them all. And my partner Elizabeth Beaton is frankly like kind of burnt out, because she and I started as true believers that if you make great work, people will come. And we have sold books, and better than some people told us we would, but certainly not enough to really impress things. So the thing I'll say about the panel is, like, all of us are attempting these things, and we have all had some successes, and we've had a wide variety of interesting failures. And I think that's the only thing that we can do. as you know, one of the tensions I feel in my own career is, am I better serving the community if I'm a writer, if I'm an editor? And I've tried to like walk the line between those two, but in a similar question is like, you know, maybe we need some people who are, you know, bring the business to this, because it's not me. that is not my skill set.
You know, Carol Lynn Pearson was pretty good at that, right? Back in the day, she was like going
Yeah.
door to door, selling her poetry. I've been, for research purposes, back in old issues of the Improvement era, when they still, in this church magazine, sold advertising space. And you see small presses of that era, which we have since forgotten the stories of, advertising in the Improvement era and reaching audiences that way. So definitely, like, there is a skill set to that entrepreneurial sort of work and understanding how to promote and advertise. I don't know whether we've got anybody as strong as Carol was right now, but that's not to say we couldn't do that. I would say if somebody's a younger writer looking to move things forward, like, that's one thing to think about, is how are you going to try to reach people, and how do you set expectations that are going to be reasonable, right? Like, you're not going to be a bestseller within this subset. One other thing that I experimented with. So last year I ended up between jobs right in the beginning of the pandemic, and finally started a Patreon account, because the thing that I've noticed, so like Mormon visual art painting, we've got a critical mass of really interesting painters doing really interesting work and able to make enough money that they can continue to do that work. And I think it's because there's a larger amount of money they make per painting, right? Literature, the economic structure of literature now is not conducive to depth of connection. If I sell a book and it's life-changing for somebody and I make $2, that's just not a good model for me. And so the question I've had for a long time is, having a smaller audience of people who care very deeply about my work, how do I then transfer that into something where it's also viable for me to spend more time on my work? And the thing I've been working with is Patreon, right? Accepting monthly contributions to people, so someone can say, you know, your work is not just worth a $2 one-time, you know, the royalty I get in a purchase, but worth $7 a month to me, right? And I'm going to be a steady supporter. And if you think about it that way, I do think if we're creative, I am hopeful about where we are. I think digital mediascapes allow people to get into niche interests in a different way than might have happened earlier. And I think there's some nice potential looking forward to how we could do funding things. So we'll see. I mean, I've got a year more. I took a job again, and I've got a year more on my contract. And then I'm going to try to make it as a Mormon writer for as long as I can until I get hungry, and then I'll go get a job again. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But
I'll be the breadwinner while
Yeah.
he's a starving artist. It's
I need a Nicole.
We all do, Mel.
Do you have other thoughts, Mel, on distribution and audience building?
I do. I have thoughts. I have feelings. I have angers. It's interesting because this idea of, you know, I mean, in theater, there's a very specific way to get published, and it's usually the play has to be really successful first, and then it's published, and the publishing of the play leads to more productions in other places, and potentially to the longevity of that play being produced a lot of places. Mormon dramatists are in this weird tiny thing where you're basically doing a show where you can afford to do a show, which usually means somebody's backyard for 2 nights, and hope that, you know, actors can be generous with their time. Because, you know, we all have to do, a starving artist is a real thing. We all have very, you know, real needs outside of artistic and creative ones. I don't like being hungry. I've been hungry a lot, and there are things I would much rather be than hungry. And yet I still, you know, do write plays for empty houses, because I can't seem to stop doing that. I don't know. I think the question of the Mormon audience, the question of creating and building an audience, I mean, part of it is doing the work, creating the play, creating the novel, creating the collection of poems and putting it out there and hoping that there is a reaction that's going to ping off of somebody else. I've had many of those experiences where, you know, yes, somebody is moved and I might get $2. Usually it's me borrowing that $2. And it's you do have a lot of conversations with yourself about, like, is it worth it for me to do this again? Elizabeth's exhaustion is a very real thing too. I feel that sometimes. I worry about the audience, because I think sometimes for me as a writer, what I'm doing is I feel like I'm creating the stuff that I want to see, and I'm not necessarily seeing it. But creating it and producing it and publishing it, those are three very separate things. You have to have a certain streak of luck for them all to happen, which is a super I get cynical. I can't help being cynical about it. I feel like it's just the struggle of being an artist, Mormon or not. But there is something peculiar about it when it's, because there's a lot of chat happening right now there's chat happening in the chat about Deseret Book, about bookstores. There is no drama section in Deseret Book. I mean, even if Deseret Book was more open, and that sounds really pejorative, but I mean, even if they were more open to more edgy work, there's still not a drama section. What do we do to get people to know that there are plays that they should be producing in other places than my backyard? This is the eternal question. I mean, I can, you know, email and call and tweet and bother people, and I am an introvert. I have a really hard time with going up to people and knocking on their door and saying, "Hi, I'm a playwright. This play is good. You should do it." And yet that's necessary to success. So and even when you do it, who knows if the success is going to be there? I don't know. I do have a lot of feelings. What are you going to say, James?
I was just going to say what we really need is time travel, because if time travel were a thing and people were coming back from the future, I think literature is one of the things you would invest in, because it can retain, it's not as consumable, right? Like it holds on to value over time, and if anything, accrues value in some cases over time, especially the more literary end of literature, right?
And
so what we need,
found a solution.
What we need is people from the future to come back and pay for us to do this now. And I say that tongue in cheek, but another thing we need is to figure out a way to collectively to value what we will care about in the future, and to not use all of our resources on sort of the, you know, whatever the consumables are right now. There's an amazing amount of resource in our community. We just don't always know how to get it there.
We have in the audience and making comments, two people who were part of AML when it first started in 1976. And I think they were there at some of the original meetings, Clifton Jolly and Wayne Jorgensen, or Bruce Jorgensen, Wayne Bruce Jorgensen. Clifton has a question. He says, Tony Kushner's Angels in America has many quasi-Mormon themes and counterintuitive modern associations with Mormon culture, doctrine, and conflict, including missionary work, eternal marriage, and angels, and in America, guilt, homosexuality, and so on. Most would not consider this play to be Mormon literature because it has no biographical connection with Mormonism. Kushner was not Mormon. And the religion is used more as a set piece or as a straw man than as an inquisitive conversation with the culture. So is this Mormon literature? Would you include this as Mormon literature? And so maybe we can broaden this to kind of include, what is the value of? Do you see any, of including in our discussions works by non-Mormons? Right now, the book that's, if you like, search novels and Mormons, David Duchovny, the actor from The X-Files, has a novel about a Mormon polygamist, which is getting reviews in the New York Times and Washington Post and places like that. So these outsider voices that are coming in and making comments about Mormon culture, what do you consider these Mormon literature, and what do you see the values of these pieces?
Sure. I'll jump in and say, like, for Angels in America, I think the fact that he was drawn to Mormon imagery is interesting. Like, could have picked any religion, but he couldn't have, right? Like the only religion that gives the sort of epic scope that he wanted was Mormonism. So I think it's interesting to put in conversation with Mormon literature by saying, yeah, this is literature dealing with Mormon imagery, even if it's engaging with other questions. At the same time, I do think it's valuable. So like in young adult literature, there's been this own voices movement that says, look, there are a lot of potential problems when you have somebody who doesn't intimately know a community representing that community. And especially if they're doing so in a way that's dismissive or that makes a rhetorical point, right? Like there's a long racist history to the stereotypes we've used with different groups. And I don't think Kushner totally avoids some of those problems. Like his Mormons don't come across as completely Mormon, right? There's some things, and that wasn't necessarily his intention, right? To make them fully authentically Mormon. There's ways he fell short. Nicole and I were at a conference once that was Jewish American literature. And so we were talking about Angels in America from that side, I think because it was in Salt Lake. But it was really interesting because there was an academic, right, in the audience who, in the paper on Angels in America, talked about how Joe Harper has never gotten a blessing from his dad. And this guy kind of turned to us and said, well, what does that say about your family values if his dad never gave him a blessing? And it's like, this is a fictional character, right? Like you realize that. And I don't know how much people always do, right? That in the way we form ideas about the world, we don't cleanly separate fact from fiction. So on the one hand, I want to embrace stuff that comes from outside and maybe doing other things. On the other, I hope that we have the self-respect to be able to have a discourse about it and not just say, I want to show how sophisticated I am by accepting anything that depicts Mormons as cool and I'm cool with it, right? Like we should have room to talk about the ethics and politics of representation.
I just want to quote comment here. It says, I think it's Michael Austin's. Is that it? Tony Kushner's Mormons are two-dimensional, but that is one dimension more than we usually get.
That's a good line.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for that.
If anybody else in the group is like paying attention to the chat and has any questions that you want to respond to, go ahead. Let's see. Here's one from Jonathan. It says, in light of the conversation around canon and the broad and generous swipes at the definition of Mormon literature, is a distinction between literature with a capital L and literature with a small l helpful, lest we languish in kitsch? Or is one of the features precisely the tendency to kitsch, and therefore the singularity and peculiarity and contrast of what rises above this illuminates and redeems that tendency? Or is it all just necessary and important and okay in its own right? Did you get all that?
Yeah, I've been reading Pauline Kael lately, and there's one thing that's clear from reading her rolled reviews is that critics were willing to murder each other over what was kitsch and what was capital L literature. I'm not sure that I think it's a useful distinction to talk about in the same way the canon is, but I think that as soon as we start feeling that we are absolutely certain where things fall on either side of that line, I would promote humility, I guess is what I would say.
So I have theories about kitsch in general and this idea of capital L literature. But let's start with kitsch. Think of what you have inherited from your parents or grandparents or great grandparents who have passed away. It used to be that there were family heirlooms that were passed down. Really, really beautiful, like china sets and things like that, right? That nice silver platter. We don't have that anymore. I can't imagine anything that I have that I will be passing to my children as like a really important piece of the household, because we live in kitsch. Like our lives are kitsch. We get lots of stuff and we fill our lives with kitsch. And so if we are dismissing as a culture anything that we're saying is lowercase l literature or kitsch literature, we need to also dismiss all of those, you know, crappy ceramic plates we get, the things that we hang on our walls, you know, the printed frames, whatever it is. Like I'm worried that we are dismissive and kind of snobbish about literature, whereas we are willing to fill our lives with kitsch and garbage TV and stuff like that, where the kitschy stuff can be really enjoyable. People can really like, and some people in the chat were talking about like reading romance novels, and they're formulaic, but sometimes they're fun. We have friends who write chick lit. They're beach reads, you know, that's what you do, and that's what it's meant to be. It's not meant to make you think really deeply and reconsider your lives. And I do think that Mormon kitsch is just a part of like being alive in the 21st century. Kitsch is our inheritance. Kitsch is what we're giving, you know, as well. And so yeah, if we can find those really beautiful pieces and sort through that and the really cool things, then I think that's great. But I don't think it means we dismiss everything else in our lives, because we waste a lot of time and energy on those other things.
And I do think one specific danger for a community like Mormons of trying to separate the two is the thing that Pakistani critic went through, right? That if we try to throw out anything because it's bad, then the internal voice that says that we are inferior can kick in really easily. And so if instead of that, we come to each text saying, look, this resonated with somebody for some reason, let me try to understand that and go from there. I think that's probably the best approach, right? And to show off a diversity of things, some that are doing maybe a more literary function, some fulfilling another function, but the place I would start asking questions about any piece of literature is not, is this good or not? Because that turns out to not always be a terribly enlightening question, but who is this resonating with and why? Yeah. And what is it doing for them?
And I think that's probably the most important thing. And but it does make it hard, because we do feel there's this exclusion, like Mel talking, there's no drama section in Deseret Book. It feels very exclusive, because there is a romance section, a very thriving romance section. There's a lot of historical fiction sections in Deseret Book. There are all of these things that are being published through the mainline Mormon publishers that come down to kitsch, but they are connecting with people. And that means people are reading about their own people and their own culture in some way, and that opens doors. I see that as opening doors for, hey, you liked this book by Dean Hughes, maybe you will like this play by Mel Larson, or this book by Stephen Peck. So
I want to respond to a follow-up comment. I think that was from Michael Austin, just saying there's maybe a noise to signal problem, or
Oh,
no, that's Darlene
That's
Young. That kids can take up all the space. And maybe back to this notion of, if you're working on a list of 100 works as an introduction to the field, you probably want to underrepresent kitsch relative to what was produced. So that your list is giving you a diversity of approach, rather than trying to just reflect production numerically, partly because it's just easier. It's easier to produce something that follows a set pattern than something that's like a new or different design or approach. So we would want to disproportionately highlight the things that went out on a limb and tried to give us a new way to approach things. But at the same time recognizing that, like, yeah, here's let's make sure that something we think of as a field that's very repetitive, we looked and found some individual works within that did something interesting or resonated in a particular way.
Mel, do you have anything you'd like to say about any of the recent discussions? And if not, I have a question for you, but first let me give you a chance to respond.
No, we can move on.
Okay, so Jennifer Writing asks, Mel, how does Mormon Lit intersect with or inform your work in adapting Austin? Or is that in a completely different category?
I think it goes, for me personally, goes back to this question of audience. And I think sometimes if I'm creating a piece that I want to see, that I don't know if a generally Mormon audience is going to be super comfortable with. But that's also part of the reason why those stories are interesting to me, and why I feel like they need to be out there and told. And sometimes you need to reach that audience in other ways, find other stories that aren't specifically Mormon and yet appeal to a Mormon audience. I think what Nicole was saying about the romance section, romance is a really interesting thing genre-wise, because you could write pages and pages and potentially books about the how romance is seen as being less than other forms of literature, but it is also primarily created and written and read by women. I think it's interesting that Jane Austen as a figure is often like kind of put into that category, even though I don't know that she belongs there. I think that there are a lot of genres happening in Austen. I think she kind of makes her own genre. And I feel like there are a lot of stories that resonate in Austen. And when you dramatize them and put them on stage, Mormon audiences find something there. It starts with this need, I suppose, this want to find something that is, for lack of a better word, safe. I think there are a lot of people that feel that Austen is safe in a way. And I feel like she is very, very complicated and complex and interesting. But I do feel like that there is something there that is satisfying both to me, that there's a place, an intersection, where I see what I want to see, and the audience can also see what they want to see. That we can both find what we are looking for in a Jane Austen, I suppose. And I know I can get butts and seats. I suppose that's what it all comes down to. I think that there's something about her work that's just really, I think it's really important. I think that her encapsulation of society is so great, and I want someone to do that for us. I want someone to be the Mormon Jane Austen. I don't know.
Okay, let's see. Connor Hilton asks, I wonder what the different role or purpose or goals of more academic criticism and more popular criticism for Mormon literature would be. Furthering the critical conversation in the Academy about Mormon Lit would certainly be great, but that only seems to be part of what we need, right? What sorts of more popular criticism opportunities are available or could be created to foster these conversations? So I guess academic, we don't have a lot of academic criticism, but we have occasionally, dialogue has its book reviews and occasional works, and we're doing some critical work here at AML. But what other opportunities are there for, I guess, everyone to get involved in their own popular criticism?
Well, somebody just mentioned book groups in the chat. Those are usually fairly democratic. That's a way to introduce books to friends and argue over them.
Okay.
That's one idea.
Okay. Nicole, James, do you have any other ideas?
Well, I think too, conversations tend to we're drawn to the things that people are already talking about. And so there are certain types of conversations that just flatten out everything else.
Yeah.
If you looked at stuff we blogged about, there's kind of whatever the church related issue of the month is. We'll devote a lot of energy to talking politics, that kind of thing. So it can be difficult to get people engaged in any other conversation, which is maybe part of the value of literature in giving some diversity to the way we spend our attention and the kind of language and mindset we're able to develop. So I think, yeah, any kind of informal criticism that gets people talking about books and having a different conversation is super welcome. I do think I talked before a little bit about how I think whether something is good or not is like the worst conversation, because it doesn't lead anywhere either way, right? Oh, this is good. Oh, this is not good. Yeah, I liked it. Yeah, I didn't, right? That tends to be kind of pretty quick dead ends. And so informal, critical conversations that get people to connect, literary representation or exploration with like life questions. I know as a writer, I would way rather, I am inspired more by seeing people talk about my work in a way that like connects to their lives and problems than I am by either criticism or praise, right? Again, the good or bad doesn't help me as a writer, but seeing people having a conversation does really spark something for me as a writer. So yeah, I think absolutely anywhere those conversations can happen are good. And if you can be a force toward getting a conversation started that people aren't already having, that's wonderful. You're tending the garden. There are ecological metaphors there.
But it's not going to happen on TikTok, Eric.
I mean, maybe a little.
You could do a musical on TikTok.
Mel, you could do a musical on TikTok.
One of my favorite Mormon playwrights has a huge TikTok account, and it's all about embroidery. So do you know Ben Abbott, Mel? He's
yes.
Yeah, his TikTok is blowing up. It's all embroidery or something, I forget, and it's big. So who knows?
TikTok is the place to go if you want things to blow up. But yeah, who knows? Indeed. I mean, I've always wondered if someone could write the Mormon spin on the Mormon answer to Fiddler on the Roof, and maybe that happens on TikTok.
That's a great idea. It'll have to be someone with a phone, though.
Someone with a phone.
Eric's out.
Eric has
someone with a phone and a piano.
Something you should know about.
Sarah Moore asks, or comments, this debate between capital L literature and small L literature resonates with the earlier debate about canon. When we are trying to determine what is capital L literature, we risk silencing marginalized voices. I'm thinking specifically about ephemeral writings of women in the 19th century, which we knew took up a large part of the printing press, but of which we have no lasting record.
I think everybody here thinks about that a lot. Yeah, there's so much. Maybe a shout out real quick to artists for all the stuff that she's been putting online that none of us would have ever seen otherwise.
It's interesting too. it's hardly marginal, right? Like Charlie was this phenomenon in its era, both the short story and then the novel. I just read the novel Charlie, like what, last month, 2 months ago?
It was sometime
Recently.
this year.
I guess it was February because it was during Mopo Rimo. Anyway, Charlie is kind of a really interesting window into some of the things that were significant in Mormon culture at the time. There's kind of different, it's presenting its own discourse about what we nominally value and should actually value. And like, it's this valuable work, even though there's maybe some prose convention things early, where if you're going to be a capital L literature, you just, a few pages in would say, oh, maybe I'm going to lump this in the other pile. So, we've talked some about more obscure works, but I think sometimes it's easy to miss things that are really mainstream Mormon market, that have interesting conversational value, like totally worth having a conversation about, and we can skip it by sticking up the nose. So there you go.
And I think the conversation is really important, and what it's getting people, like literature is meant to make people think and feel. And that's why we keep going to theater. That's why we keep reading poetry. That's why we read novels. It makes us think and feel in different ways. And when you are a Latter-day Saint and that's your worldview, having somebody write about that on one level or another, whether it's a kitsch thing or it's a really thoughtful piece by an obscure writer, it's about that connection. And maybe I think too much in terms of the audience, but I feel that's where it really matters. And so we don't want to dismiss literature because it was popular, because the person actually made a living writing. We want to make sure that we are looking at how we as Mormons, as Latter-day Saints, are reinterpreting our own lives and our own beliefs and our own selves because of the literature with which we are engaging.
Michael Austin commented, Charlie was a very important book for the teenage me in the way that he pushed back fairly hard on LDS purity culture. When Sam finds out that his fiancée Charlie had sex before, he tells the bishop he doesn't think he can marry her, and the bishop takes away his temple recommend for not believing in the atonement. I mean, I had that same memory as well.
And let me say quickly about that moment. One, super important. Two, I read Dorian right around the same time that I read Charlie, and it has a comparable moment, right? Where you have a male protagonist making sense of the fact that this woman he's interested in has had sex, and coming to sort of similar conclusions, right? So that's another reason why it's worth reflecting on the past, to see these things in conversation with each other, even if they weren't. Like, I kind of doubt that Jack Wayland had casually read Dorian, although it's possible. I think more that we end up having conversations across time because these are like perennial issues in the culture that we interact with again. But it's easy to assume that we're the first people who discovered there was an issue with purity culture, when like you can see generations of writers wrestling with that and trying again and again to invite readers to adopt less rigid and more Christ-like attitudes.
Christine Hagelin asks, do you think that correlation impacts the possibility of entrepreneurially promoting literature? I feel like Latter-day Saints are generally more skeptical of anything that doesn't have the Deseret book Nihil Obstat, which I had to look up, which means Latin for nothing hindering, which was a declaration from the Catholic Church that this was a book that was approved for reading. So Latter-day Saints are generally more skeptical of anything that doesn't have that Deseret book seal on it than when Carolyn Pearson was going door to door.
Yeah, and I think being able to advertise in Improvement Era was one way to show before that this is part of a Mormon conversation that we lost, right? Once we said we don't have paid advertisements within our material, there's that. I know I talked with a panel of people who all write in Spanish. And one issue they said is, you think it's bad here, like in Spanish speaking countries where you don't have as many, there's not a blogosphere and Maxwell Institute and these sort of in between things. There has been suspicion from audiences about like, are we supposed to even be doing this, right? Aren't we supposed to be listening to the approved church voices? And so it's taken a little bit of extra work to overcome that concern. So I absolutely think that's a reality. I mean, I think part of the solution is you just find the people you can and work from there. Certainly it helps when you can get some general authorities to quote some Mormon lit in
That's
conference and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So people were writing before in the chat about, mailing their books to the First Presidency and the 12 and the Relief Society presidency, General Relief Society presidency. So
wasn't the last conference, wasn't there a literary work that was quoted that everyone was very excited about? I'm trying to remember what that was.
So we were really excited 2 years ago when Gabriel Garcia Nunez's dad quoted Gabriel's piece that was in the Mormon Lit Blitz. That was really cool. It was a really good piece. The God I can trust, but we didn't know it was his dad until afterwards. So we were like, what? So that was exciting.
Christine said Sharon Harris's Book of Mormon volume from the Maxwell Institute was quoted.
Was cited, yeah.
Yeah, Sharon's good.
I have a suggestion too. Carolyn Pearson is in my stake, and she is a very visible member of the stake. If you've ever met Carolyn, that will not surprise you. She is willing to take up plenty of space. This is not, I don't mean that in like a derogatory way, like love Carolyn. And watching her, it also reminds me of something I read Orson Scott Card talk about once, about how he tries to be a really good citizen in his ward and in his stake. He doesn't need to prove he's a weird artist because everyone will know he's weird and they'll see he's trying to fit in and appreciate that. And those two models have meant a lot to me. I think that maybe part of the responsibility here goes on the artists to be active parts of the community and also not ashamed of being Latter-day Saints. There's this weird myth in Mormondom that you can't be a good artist without an eventual excommunication, which I refuse to subscribe to. And I think that the artists just being part of the community can make a big difference. Like, there's no reason we can't talk about the arts. If they're part of our lives, they're going to come up in conversation. And I think maybe we could try a little harder to walk in both the worlds in a visible way.
I'm going to piggyback on that really quickly to go to a comment that Mary Jane's got in the chat, which has struck me because I think it's basically exactly what I want to do, which is to successfully market something Mormon literature to a non-Mormon audience, to the broader public. I think what's interesting about bringing up Angels in America and the Book of Mormon musical and instances in which Mormon characters are being written by non-Mormon writers is I would like to see a Mormon writer be writing about Mormons for a wider, broader audience that I think includes the Mormon audience. I think the Mormon audience is included in that, but to be creating something, that's a goal that I have, which is to be telling a straight up Mormon story, to be walking in those footsteps, to be aiming at that audience, but to be aiming at the same time at a wider, broader audience, to say, hey, this is who we are. These are our stories. Our stories are interesting and quirky and of literary value, and we want to share them. I think in a weird roundabout ricochet way, having that success more broadly will lead to more success inside.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
think,
I want to like write that sentence down and revise it, but there it is.
and I think part of that is we're so self-conscious as a community that we lap up outside affirmation, sometimes to our detriment, right? Like we historically, I think, have been kind of manipulated by praise more than we've been affected by persecution or criticism. I do think, yeah, for writers here, like on the one hand, I think it's good to aim for that. On the other hand, you've just got to get firm in what your sense of self is, because like the experience, I don't know why it is not like universal among people who want to write about Mormonism to go look at other ethnic groups first and really, like, other people have been down this path and we can learn from them. There is so much pressure to present yourself in the way that an establishment expects you to be presented, right? So you have this pattern of like self-exoticizing in order to fit an outside standard or expectation. And like tons of minority groups have struggled with that.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, on the one hand, yes, I want to reach out for a broader audience. On the other hand, knowing that broad audiences often come with the marketing resources of a conventional organization, and that there can be some bias built into those. It's just, it's fraught, right? And I would rather do my best to be honest and tell the kind of story I want to tell than be successful. And I would love more of an audience to come around and join that and not need that outside affirmation. I don't know if that'll happen.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'm saying I'm reaching out for affirmation.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, of course I want to be honest in
Yep.
storytelling. I just feel that sometimes it's more likely to be, I just feel like right now, okay, I feel like right now I don't have the words for what I'm saying. I feel like production and publication, those things are fraught anyway.
Right.
I think, I feel like there's potential not for support but for making in other places. I feel like here it's just me by myself. I have to make it by myself, and it would be really cool to have a Mormon play be done somewhere else, so that Angels in America is not necessarily the bar for what Mormon drama is, because it's not. And I think that requires a Mormon writer to tell an honest story. It's not about, it's not just about getting a great review in the New York Times. It's about doing the play somewhere else. It's about the plays getting done, and I don't know what to do to get them done. I can't get them done here without just spending money. It's like throwing money in a hole.
Yeah.
Yep. No, and I think it's a worthy goal. I just think it's sometimes people who are new to the field or looking into the field from outside and judging us for not having gotten more done just go, if you were a better writer, this would have happened already. And I don't think there's always an understanding of the sort of layers of challenge on the way.
Well, we're about at the end of our time, but let's give everyone a chance to make any kind of final comments, things you wanted to say before we ended. Eric, you have any?
Final comments. I don't have a closing statement prepared. All right, how about this? So one of my something I absolutely believe is that in the idea that we are children of heavenly parents in some concrete way, and that our existence reflects theirs. And one of the key aspects that we know about them is that they are creators. And so I do think that for as much failure and false starts and so forth that Mormon literature has experienced over its lifetime, we can also see those beautiful aspects of our godly nature, and we should be looking for them, and we should be building more of them. And rah, let's go.
Nicole, anything you'd like to say?
I liked rah rah, let's go. That was good. I just feel that we have a really great opportunity here. I think this is a great time to share as much as we can because of, social media connections and digital connections and publishing online. We have dozens of old copies of journals and things in our home, and I would rather go online and read. And I think we all kind of feel that way. And so I just really feel like if we can do more projects to catalog and get people connected through online historical works and contemporary works, then we're going to open up this conversation even more and reach more people. So
Thank you.
that's
Thank
all.
you. Yeah.
I guess one of my closing thoughts would be that, this talk is one in a series, and you're going to be thinking about Mormon thought and Mormon whatever else. I certainly, Mormon history has paid me a lot more money than Mormon literature ever has, but I do think literature as a mode of engagement gives you this more rounded experience. Like there are tools in literature that you're not going to get everywhere else. So I think that as we're trying to use the humanities for our culture, and as we're thinking about what our community needs, I really hope people don't leave literature out because it's less established, because there have been fewer resources devoted, because I think it's just so necessary to a rich, like fully realized culture moving forward.
Mel, do you have any final comments?
Rah, rah, let's go.
Let's go.
Right?
Thank you everyone so much for participating. This is great. I hope that everyone listening will continue to participate in the AML conference that'll be this week. Be aware of the books that are giving awards and the people who will be awarded, and take that as a very strong recommendation, and go out and buy their works and tell more people about it. Elizabeth, can I turn it back to you?
Yes, thank you so much. This was a fantastic panel and just highlights what greatness is to come at the conference. And we'd love to have you all come back for next month's panel. It will be on the 24th, and the topic will be, what is Mormon art? The best place to stay in touch for updates about that would be the Mormon Scholars in the Humanities Facebook page. So if you're not already a member over there, go find us and